The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. It's good to have you all here tonight. I'd like to let you all know that this is a live call-in show. You can call in at 343-9927, 343-9927 to discuss the topic of the evening, which is sustainable transportation. And with us tonight to share his expertise and tell us all about it is Mr. Mark Martin. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening.
Good to have you here. And, of course, one of my faithful co-hosts, Lang Baker's here also as well. Hello, Lang.
Hi, Wayne.
Okay, sustainable transportation. The name seems to explain itself, but how about explaining it to us, Mark?
Well, when I first started looking into this, I thought it explained itself too, but it turns out it doesn't really. There are lots and lots of different definitions, but I settled on one out of Canada that is apparently fairly widely acceptable. And they refer to a triple bottom line in that sustainable transportation is a positive good for the environment, for the economy, and for society. Those things, for the environment, it means switching over to renewable sources for energy. For the economy, it's that it doesn't put a burden on this generation and generations to come to maintain a system. And for society, that it be equitable, that all people can access it.
Okay, so it's sustainable basically for the earth. That's where the sustainable comes from.
It's sustainable for the earth, certainly, and for the economy, because when you're building large programs that require maintenance, you keep putting an additional economic burden on the culture and the society. And it's a burden, it's sustainable for society as a whole, that everybody can access these things without an undue burden on themselves.
Okay. Is it being implemented at all in Baton Rouge? Are we having any success? Is anybody trying?
Well, I think that there are some nascent programs that are going on, but historically, no. We have a single mode of transportation in Baton Rouge, and that's the automobile. Personal, one owner, one occupant.
Yeah. Well, now, what kind of ideas does sustainable transportation offer to be sustainable transportation? Presumably some way to replace cars, or?
Well, again, if you're looking at automobiles, the idea would be to transit from petroleum to a renewable source of energy, which usually means, in the long run, electricity from wind, solar, other natural sources that are renewable. On the economy, that the systems you build not be so burdensome that we can't afford to pay for it, and that we don't burden future generations with paying off the loans that we're taking to build these things. And that, in Louisiana, if you don't have a car, how do you get around? So the societal part of this is that there's a huge burden on people. And if it takes, according to AAA, about $9,000 a year in Louisiana to maintain and operate an automobile, the average income, I think, in Louisiana is around $24,000. So that's over a third of the home income. My math is bad, so don't cut me on that. It's almost a third of take home. So how can anybody afford to have rent, food, clothing, and pay a third of their stuff just to get around?
Huh. Now, you mean maintenance. I have a relatively new vehicle. It only costs me whatever it costs to get the tires rotated and oil changed and filters and all that occasionally.
Do you own the car, or do you pay a note?
I own it outright.
Okay, so you had to pay for the thing to begin with.
You're including...
Yeah, it's the entire cost of ownership.
Sure.
It's not just buying the thing, but maintaining it, getting the licensing, getting the brakes fixed, getting the tires when you need them.
Right, $9,000 a year.
Everything.
Yeah.
Insurance, which is one of the reasons that we have one of the highest insurance rates in the country, because people can't afford the insurance, and we have a lot of uninsured drivers. And that drives this negative loop where The more people don't have insurance, the more expensive insurance becomes, and so the more people can't afford it, and and it just keeps getting worse and worse.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned Canada at the beginning of the broadcast. Have they implemented sustainable? I noticed that a lot of the slides in your PowerPoint were based on data from them or ideas from somewhere up in Canada.
Right. They've done a lot of work, much more than, well, I can't say much more than the United States, but they have done a great deal of work looking at these problems and are trying to implement those things for themselves as well.
Okay. One of the things that were brought up on the PowerPoint slide, and it's for the listeners, it's a PowerPoint that Mark shared with Lang and me that describes sustainable transportation. But there was a question that was asked, who is more sustainable, somebody who drives a fuel-efficient vehicle, high annual miles, or somebody who drives an inefficient vehicle, low annual miles? And I copied a table here if you want to look at that for your own reference. But I thought that was interesting. Everybody kind of assumes that you buy a high-efficiency car and you're doing your duty, you're doing your job.
Well, in some small degree that's true, but if in the process of having a high-efficiency vehicle you drive a lot, you wind up negating that efficiency. It's because it's not simply a matter of how much fuel you're using. It's all the ancillary things that go with having that automobile. If you're going to drive that car to 7 places in town, you now have required 7 parking places that have to be there or else you don't use it.
Plus wear and tear on the road.
Plus the wear and tear on the roads, plus, all these, it's just, there are so many things that are involved with an automobile. We tend to think of driving an automobile and being nothing more than getting into it and putting gas in it. That's
something that this taught me, was that the pictures are great, a lot bigger than that, and it's all interconnected.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, if you go out on the river, if you ride up and down on the levee like I do almost every day, you'll see the tankers in the river coming up to Exxon to get what they're getting or dropping off what they're dropping off. And that's part of a global network.
Yeah.
And that's to get gasoline into your car. Every one of those stages along the way of producing gasoline has its own costs.
Well, you mentioned parking spaces. And we did talk about damage or, wear and tear on the roads. Also, congestion. Mm-hmm. Congestion also is a contributing factor. If you're out there on the road, even in a high-efficiency vehicle, you're contributing to congestion. What does that cause? Well, how does that contribute?
Oh, gosh. So many different ways. Just being in an automobile all the time tends to shorten human lifespans. This is a result of a number of studies. It causes various health issues. The cost to the environment of engines idling in congestion is greater than that of an engine running smoothly and efficiently. Time lost is bearing on business and production. There are incredible amounts of downstream effects. It's not just you being in a car sitting somewhere by yourself waiting for it to move. There are all these other things, like dropping a rock in a pond. There are all these ripples that come out of it.
Yeah, it seems like that's the case with everything in nature.
Indeed. And we don't think of ourselves and driving as part of a system. We think of it as a single thing separated from all the things that it affects and all the things that are affected by it and to it.
That sounds kind of like the human condition, though. I mean, we all, those who...
Yeah.
But anyway, that's... how about the parking spaces you mentioned? That brings up something you touched on, was the amount of paved surface area in Baton Rouge or any cities. And I gave you my notes here. There was a name for it. Impermeable surfaces, I think is what it's called.
Impermeable surfaces. Well, and again, this is part of the effect of having an automobile. If you just had an automobile and you just left it on your front yard on the grass, you would eventually kill the area of grass underneath the car.
Okay.
If you never moved it, that would be kind of okay, because the car would be blocking just the amount of surface area that the car itself took up. But if you want to get from your car to a road, you've paved something. And every one of those paved surfaces is impermeable. The house that you're in provides an impermeable surface. The parking lots are impermeable. The streets are impermeable. All of these things cover the surface of the planet in a way that they cannot absorb, which is what impermeable means, any of the water, any of the rain that comes down on it. So it has to go somewhere because it's not just going to hit the ground, bounce up, and go back in the sky.
No.
It's going to go somewhere. Well, that means in Baton Rouge, it goes into our storm sewer combined system, which doesn't take much to overwhelm.
As we've recently found out.
Well, the recent flood was an extreme example of what happens. I mean, even when we have a short, intense thunderstorm, it will overwhelm our system in such a way that I was coming back from a place one night coming down Tulip after a rainstorm like that, and there were parts of Tulip where the water was up over the bottom bracket on my bicycle, and at some points it was halfway up my shin on the downstroke. This was from a single rainstorm that happened in 30 minutes. It was a lot of rain. It happened really quickly. It was one street, but that's a main street in a neighborhood, and there was that much water standing in the street.
Yeah, now that you mention it, though, they have flash flood warnings all the time when we have heavy rains. And I remember the underpass at Chippewa, I think it was, is notorious for flooding out.
As is the one on Acadian.
Yeah, okay. So, and, my street, I live in one of the higher points in Baton Rouge. I found that out during the floods because I was checking. But I live in a cul-de-sac, dead-end street, and it drains across another road into a ditch. And every time it rains heavily, my street is full of water. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not real deep, but it's still, it backs up. And it takes a little while for it to drain out once it stops raining. So, yeah. And that I'm sure that basically the effect of paving and building like we're doing forces the water to run away from these areas. It forces that drainage area to shrink, basically.
Well, the recharge area shrinks.
Recharge.
Well, so that groundwater, the rain hits the ground. If it can go into the ground, it recharges the water table and the ground itself.
Okay.
The impermeable surfaces shrink the amount of area that the water can actually do what it would want to do.
That nature lets it do, yes.
Yes. And so instead, it has to go and do what it's going to do anyway, which is find the lowest spot it can find.
So could that be contributing to along with other industrial factors, the drop in our water table or aquifer, or is
the aquifer is fossil water. It takes a lot longer for that to happen.
Okay.
But when it comes to rain and that sort of thing and impermeable surfaces, it's a question of absorbing and slowing down the runoff.
Yeah.
That has to. It's not so much you really don't want to use surface water for potable water.
Good point. I was thinking, I don't know. I just exposed my ignorance of, geography or topography or whatever, and that's okay. I don't know.
Well, you're no longer ignorant, so that's great.
Well, not that way anyway. I'm sure you could reach my limits in plenty of other ways fairly quickly. But that's what it's all about. That's why I do shows like this. That's why I meet and enjoy people like you, and Lang, of course, and Johnny when he's on the show, because these people teach me new things and expose me to new ideas and thoughts. Speaking of which, you can call in and share your thoughts and ideas here on A Pause for Thought, 343-9927, 343-9927. And if we seem to be fading as you head outside of our broadcast area, you can live stream at whyr.org and call in and share your ideas or have your questions with the show. You mentioned the ground providing a service of absorbing rainwater and the like, and the fact that we're reducing that available land. But isn't the available areas for drainage affected too? And didn't that not have an influence on the recent floods?
Yeah, I mean, when you've got a whole bunch of the city parish planning commission has on their website a map that shows the impermeable surface of the parish. A great deal of the parish is somewhere above 25% and impermeable, and a surprising amount is between, I think it's 60 and 100% impermeable. So
impermeable, yeah.
Right. So when it rains, all that water hits the street, hits the roof, hits whatever it is, the parking lot. It has to go somewhere, and so it starts flowing. And it's going to find a low spot, which is what water does. So when it finally gets somewhere, that it can then continue out of the streets and the impermeable surfaces, then is where I think you're talking about this drainage effect.
Yeah.
Well, we've got an awful lot, as we found out recently, bayous and drainage ways that are not normally wet under normal conditions that become those drainage channels. And they're all heading down southeast into the Amite. The Comite comes down, goes into the Amite. The Amite goes down and goes into Manchac, and tries to get down to Lake Maurepas and all this. So on this side of the levee for the Mississippi, this stuff doesn't drain into the Mississippi. It goes the other way, southeast. So those channels are open, but they're not open enough.
Not deep enough, not wide enough, and
Well, not for the current conditions and the changing
Right.
conditions we're suffering. I mean, we've had 4 floods in Louisiana in the last 18 months. 4 major floods in 18 months.
wow.
And, Shreveport got hit, Monroe got hit, over Ponchatoula got hit, and we got hit. And then if you expand that and include our ecological area, Houston has been flooded twice this year.
Yeah, they saw some major ones. Well, I guess I have to say we saw a major one last
Yeah.
August. Yeah, and actually they've been occurring in, I think, Wyoming it was. I found out when I was at the Grassroots Radio Conference in Hot Springs this past weekend. Maryland, I saw footage
Maryland.
of that back in July where water was rushing down the main street of the
West
of the town.
Virginia?
Yeah, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, so, but again, that a lot of that's probably due to the excessive rains, due to climate change.
I would think so, yes.
But I'm sure that all of the impermeable surfaces have a lot to do with that too, perhaps more so.
I remember the scene out of Maryland. That water was coming down one of the main streets in town
Undermining buildings.
and undermining the
Yeah.
street and
Yep.
taking everything out because,
Yeah, that's just where it had to go. You mentioned at the beginning of the show, or maybe it was before we went on the air, about the political will or lack thereof. And you did mention just a moment ago about the parish commissioners.
the Planning Commission.
Planning Commission, okay. Well, yeah, that was one thing I wanted to ask you. There was an article quoted on the PowerPoint from June 20th, 2016, from the Baton Rouge Advocate, from the Advocate here, that talked about a new subdivision that the East Baton Rouge commissioners had shot down. And I guess I was going to ask about that, the lollipop developments that are kind of were spawned by the interstate. This was one of those, I guess. But can you talk about that? How did the interstate highway affect
Wow.
sustainable transportation, just in Baton Rouge, say? Leave it here.
Yeah. Well, that's plenty. Gosh. Well, and all this there's a large, it's a big ball of wax. And there's a lot of things involved in it that are all interconnected. Again, it's not just a question of getting in your car and going somewhere and that's it. Back, I guess maybe within the last 20 years, there was a phrase that the realtors came up with which was drive until you qualify. And what that means is that the further you get from a city, the cheaper the housing becomes. So if you can drive far enough away, then you can qualify for a home, and then you can just drive back into town. Now, nobody says that additional driving is going to increase your costs, that whatever you saved on the house, you're probably going to burn up in your transportation.
Right, and end up having to buy a new vehicle a lot sooner than otherwise.
All the costs then go on to the individual on the pretense that if we just keep sprawling out, you'll be able to do whatever you want.
Right.
So along with the impermeable surfaces, because there are streets, there are houses, there are driveways, here there aren't sidewalks. You've got the problem where a realtor, the developer, is responsible for the traffic impact study, not the city.
Oh, great. That explains a lot, though.
It sure does. Because every time a new development goes in, oddly enough, it never impacts the traffic. Now, if you talk to somebody who lives out on Tiger Bend or Hushutu, they can tell you that that's a complete lie.
Yes.
But, nonetheless, under the way the rules are written in this parish, that responsibility lies with the developer. And the parish is not responsible for going in and saying, are you really sure this is true? So That's what we have. So this development they were talking about was out on Tiger Bend in an area of land that hadn't been developed ever, and there's a very good reason for that. One side of it is along the Amite River, and the other side is kind of defined by Clay Cut Bayou.
Right. That's the one I saw.
Yeah. And so Tiger Bend runs along, I think, sort of the west, going from northwest to southeast on that sort of Hipworth triangle. And the Amite is on the east side of that triangle.
Okay.
There's an existing number of subdivisions north of it. And so this undeveloped, forested, such as it is, wooded, let's say, land was going to be developed. And because of the way the UDC, the Uniform Development Code, is written, they were able to finesse making it something that it wasn't.
Okay, now, was this low? I don't mean to cut you off, but it was low. Yeah, I guess it was low ground.
Yes.
Huh? Yeah, so it was part of the drainage, really. It's part of where water drained to go into the Amite or to Clay Cut Bayou.
Yes, both.
Okay, and they were going to probably fill that.
They had to raise the part they were going to develop, I don't know how far, but whatever it was, it made the people north of them who already lived there in a development very nervous, because that would have been essentially putting a dam on the edge of their property.
Sure.
So they live there. They know they're against the river just like everybody else in that area was, and it became a very contentious issue. There were at least two very, very long meetings with the Planning Commission where everybody got a chance to speak. And at the second one, it started into that argument again, and they just shut it down and said it's denied. Okay. And then a week later, it was under 6 feet of water.
How about that?
Yeah. Or more. I don't know how deep it got out there.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that was 2016. Yeah, so that was fairly recently. Now, we didn't make clear, though, that the interstates and other major highways, road projects, make this sprawl possible.
That certainly,
right?
Here it's almost exclusively the interstate.
Yeah.
We, because of the way we have developed and the way we have built our roads and provided access across waterways, the interstate is it's like a main street here. Everybody gets on it.
Hence the congestion. And
yeah. Well, when you have a situation where when a great number of people live to the east outside the parish and they work in this parish, and they're going back and forth all the time, where they go across the river. Sometimes they go all the way across East Baton Rouge to go into West Baton Rouge. You've got this main thoroughfare, which is an interstate, which is never what it was intended to be. And then you've also got a problem where you don't have distributaries. If it were a river, there are no distributaries there. There are no smaller roads that you can get across to avoid it. You can come across on Florida Boulevard, but that's about the only other place. And it flooded, as did the interstate. So you have this main thoroughfare, and then you've got this feedback system where businesses look for car access. So when Whole Foods built in Baton Rouge, one of their criteria was how close is it to a main thoroughfare. Mm-hmm. And so they built it there on Corporate.
And Jefferson, yeah. Jefferson Highway.
And so, you can get to it from 4 directions, but you got to come up College off the interstate.
Which is always a mess.
Yes, because of the way it's been built. The old part of town, which is pretty much everything inside of Airline Highway up to about, it gets kind of funky down in the southeast part in the sense that the roads are angled. Say College, Acadian, it's a grid. Pretty much everything outside of that is not a grid, and it's not connected. And so you get these other problems where you've got one way in, one way out. All the traffic goes onto a single road, which in the most part out that way was 2-lane. Now they're trying to make them 4-lane or larger. Congestion builds up. Development continues to sprawl out. Congestion gets worse. On and on and on and on.
Yes, and we build wider and wider roads, always too late. I mean, it's always behind traffic flow.
See, the traffic engineers through their studies, they invented a term called induced demand.
Ah, okay. I'm familiar with that, I think.
And
Go ahead.
This is a thing that the engineers themselves came up with. This is not something that I just pulled out of the air or somewhere else. That was so. What it's saying is that the more capacity you have on a roadway, the more people will use it.
Sure.
Build it and they will come.
Yeah, exactly. And
Well, the
so-
interstate highway system is a perfect example of that. They weren't expecting it to get the usage it gets now.
right.
And it basically spawned the trucking industry, or,
Certainly
caused an explosion, yeah.
Exactly. So here in town, I don't know if you're going to get to this later, but I looked up to find what I could to see how much has been spent on road and street projects between 2000 and 2016 just in this parish. And the ones it's about $2 billion.
But that comes from the people that use the road, right? Our gasoline taxes.
We'll talk about that in a moment. So at the same time we've spent this $2 billion on building more roads, congestion has gone up every year. The costs
Yeah.
have gone up every
Yep.
year. So if your intent in building wider roads and more roadways is to reduce congestion, you have failed miserably.
You've caused the problem.
Exactly. You're just creating, again, one of those negative feedback loops that makes the problem worse. The more you do, the worse it gets. And we're about to spend another $100 million on widening the interstate east of here. So, clearly to me, if you look at those data, the intent is not to reduce congestion.
You would think if our politicians and officials are using reason and logic. Well, they don't mix well.
That is a problem, isn't it?
Yeah, well, there are vested interests too. The developers need to develop to make money. The realtors need to sell real estate.
The concrete guys got to sell concrete.
Sure, all that stuff. Let's get back to the taxes here. We have a few minutes left. I got the impression from something Lang said that our taxes don't necessarily, our gasoline taxes don't necessarily pay for the roads.
Absolutely not. I mean, the taxes go into a fund, but
a general fund or a road fund?
Well, they're supposed to go to a road fund, but the last 15 or 20 years, everybody's raiding everything they can find, and so the monies that are supposed to be somewhere aren't.
Right.
So if we go with the ideal and the intent, let's say that all those taxes go in.
Well,
But
go ahead.
The problem is that if you the thing I had done for that PowerPoint was to look at what is the average efficiency of an American automobile and what is the average distance people drive, and I made the efficiency a quarter less efficient, and the amount of mileage twice as much, so that essentially the amount of tax you would pay on the gasoline for that would be double what would you do if I had not made those adjustments.
Okay.
So if you increase that tax by 100%,
Mm-hmm.
on the projects I looked at in that PowerPoint, you'd buy at most an inch. An individual would buy at most an inch of the roadway with their gas taxes.
And that's just one roadway, or?
It depends on the cost of the project, because every project is different. I mean, a bridge will cost 3 times as much as a mile of road without a bridge.
Okay, and what's our population here in Baton Rouge? Somewhere around 700,000 or something like that?
No, I think in the city itself it's 250,000. In the metro area it's about 500,000.
So that many inches.
Yes.
Say
Well, it's not enough.
No, obviously.
And
750 inches is not very long.
And the bulk of that money comes from federal money, which is made from the federal tax, but also from income tax and sales taxes. The Greenlight Plan, which is all the city of parish streets, is strictly a sales tax. So everybody pays that half-cent sales tax. That doesn't come out of one particular part of the culture. It comes from everybody. So those taxes that people are paying for their gasoline does not nearly pay for the cost of just building the stuff, much less doing anything like maintenance or repair or any of that stuff.
Fascinating. Imagine, we have some of the lowest gasoline prices in the world, I think, here in the United States.
We do, and we in the state have some of the lowest taxes.
Yes, and we see the result of that in many ways, I suppose.
Yes.
Is there a website that people can go to get educated on sustainable transportation?
There are many, and if they do a Google search for sustainable transportation, they will wallow in more information than they ever thought was available.
Okay, well, that'll be cool. Of course, only your curious people will
Indeed.
go, but that's the way it goes. But anyway, we're curious people here. I'm a kind of a curious guy in more ways than one. But, well, we've been talking with Mark Martin. Lang Baker has been listening, I guess, for the show, but thanks for being here and doing some research, Lang. And you've been listening to Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. We thank you for listening, and we got to go. Have a good evening.